Sarah Martinez stood outside the big glass doors of Whitmore Music Academy. Her hands were shaking as she held a brown folder with her sheet music inside. The folder was old and had tape on the corners where it was broken. She had used it since high school. The building in front of her looked like a palace. It had tall, white columns and gold decorations around the windows. Everything was clean and shiny. Sarah had never seen anything like it before. She lived in a small apartment with her mother and younger brother. Their building had broken stairs and peeling paint on the walls. Sarah took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy door. Inside was even more beautiful than outside. The floor was made of smooth marble that reflected the light from big crystal lights hanging from the ceiling. There were paintings of famous musicians on the walls. Everything smelled like expensive perfume and fresh flowers. Other students were walking around the lobby. They all looked confident and relaxed. The girls wore designer dresses and had perfect hair. The boys had expensive suits and shiny shoes. They talked and laughed loudly about their summer trips to Europe and their private music teachers. Sarah looked down at her own clothes. She wore her best dress, but it was from a discount store. Her mother had bought it for her high school graduation. The black shoes on her feet were comfortable but old. She had polished them that morning until they looked as good as possible. She walked slowly across the marble floor, trying not to make noise with her shoes. A group of students near a grand piano stopped talking and looked at her. She heard one of them whisper something, and then they all started laughing quietly. Sarah felt her face get hot with embarrassment. The lobby had several comfortable chairs arranged in small groups. Sarah found an empty chair in the corner and sat down carefully. She put her folder on her lap and tried to look like she belonged there, but inside, her heart was beating fast and her hands were still shaking. She thought about her grandmother, Rosa, who had taught her to play piano. Rosa had died 2 years ago, but Sarah could still hear her voice. "Music comes from the heart, Mia," Rosa used to say. "It doesn't matter if your piano is old or if your hands are rough from work. What matters is what you feel inside." Rosa's piano was indeed old. It was an upright piano that Rosa had bought used when Sarah's mother was young. Some of the keys stuck when you pressed them. The sound was not perfect, but it was the piano where Sarah learned to love music. Sarah's family did not have much money. Her mother worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night and taking care of elderly people during the day. Her father had left when Sarah was 12. Since then, her mother struggled to pay for everything they needed. There was never money for music. Lessons. Sarah taught herself by watching videos on the internet and borrowing books from the library. She practiced every day after school while her mother was at work. The neighbors sometimes complained about the noise, but Sarah could not help herself. Playing piano made her feel peaceful and happy. When Sarah was 17, she started working part-time at a coffee shop to help her family with money. She still practiced piano every morning before school and every night before bed. Her hands often smelled like coffee and cleaning supplies, but she washed them carefully before touching the piano keys. Sarah's music teacher at high school, Mrs. Johnson, was the first person to tell her she was truly talented. "You have something special," Mrs. Johnson had said. "You should audition for music school." Sarah laughed because music school cost too much money, but Mrs. Johnson kept encouraging her. One day, Mrs. Johnson brought Sarah information about scholarships at Whitmore Music Academy. "They give full scholarships to students who are really good," she explained. "You should try." Sarah was scared, but she decided to apply. The application process was difficult. Sarah had to record herself playing piano, write essays about her musical experience, and get recommendation letters. She worked on everything during her free time at the coffee shop and at home late at night. When the acceptance letter came, Sarah could not believe it. She was invited to audition for a full scholarship. If she got it, she could study music without paying anything. It was her dream come true. But now, sitting in the beautiful lobby of Whitmore Music Academy, Sarah felt very small and out of place. Everyone around her seemed to know exactly what they were doing. They talked about famous musicians like they were friends. They mentioned concerts they had attended and competitions they had won. Sarah opened her folder and looked at her music. She had chosen to play a piece that her grandmother loved, a simple Mexican lullaby that Rosa used to sing to her when she was little. Sarah had arranged it for piano herself, mixing the traditional melody with classical techniques she had learned from books and videos. The piece was not very difficult compared to what other students probably played, but it meant everything too. Sarah, it reminded her of sitting next to Rosa on the piano bench, learning her first chords. It reminded her of late nights practicing while her mother slept, dreaming of a better future. A girl with blonde hair and a pearl necklace sat down near Sarah. She was talking on her phone about her recent performance at Carnegie Hall. "Daddy says the review in the newspaper was wonderful," she said loudly. "The critics said I played like a professional." Sarah felt her confidence disappearing. How could she compete with people who performed at famous concert halls? How could her simple song compare to whatever these students would play? She closed her folder and stood up. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe she should go home and forget about music school. She could work full-time at the coffee shop and help her mother pay the bills. That would be more practical, but as she started walking toward the door, Sarah heard piano music coming from one of the practice rooms. Someone was playing a beautiful classical piece. The music was perfect. Every note was clear and precise. But something was missing. Sarah could not feel any emotion in the music. It sounded like a machine playing, not a human being. Sarah stopped walking. She remembered Rosa's words again. "Music is not about playing the right notes, Mia. It is about telling your story." Maybe these students could play difficult pieces perfectly, but Sarah had something they might not have. She had a story to tell. She turned around and walked back to her chair. She would stay for the audition. She would play her grandmother's lullaby with all the love and hope in her heart. Maybe it would be enough. Maybe her story mattered too. Sarah was still sitting in the corner when she heard loud laughter coming from the center of the lobby. A group of students had gathered around someone who was telling a story. Sarah could see a tall young man with perfect brown hair and an expensive gray suit. He was waving his hands as he talked, and everyone around him was laughing at his jokes. "So there I was at the Vienna Music Festival," the young man said with a big smile. "The conductor looked at me and said, 'Marcus, you play that piece better than musicians twice your age.'" Everyone in the group made sounds of admiration. Of course, when you've been studying with Professor Heinrich since you were 5, these things come naturally. Sarah learned that his name was Marcus. She could tell he was rich by the way he dressed and talked. His suit looked like it cost more money than Sarah's family spent on food for a whole month. He wore a gold watch that caught the light every time he moved his hand. His shoes were so shiny they looked like mirrors. "Marcus, tell them about your performance at the Kennedy Center," said a girl with red hair and diamond earrings. She looked at Marcus like he was a movie star. Marcus smiled even bigger. "Well, that was quite special. I was the youngest person ever invited to play at their gala dinner. The ambassador from Germany was there, and he told my father that my performance reminded him of the great masters." He paused for effect. But really, when you have access to the best teachers and the finest instruments, excellence is just expected. Sarah noticed how Marcus talked about money and success like they were normal things. He mentioned his father's business connections and his mother's charity events. He talked about flying to different countries for music competitions and staying in fancy hotels. To him, these things were just part of life. Other students in the group shared their own stories. They talked about private concerts in their homes and famous musicians who came to dinner at their houses. They mentioned schools in Switzerland and summer programs in Italy. Each story seemed more impressive than the last. Sarah felt like she was listening to people from another planet. She had never been on an airplane. She had never stayed in a hotel. The fanciest restaurant she had ever been to was the diner where her mother sometimes took the family for special occasions like birthdays. A girl with long black hair and a designer handbag looked around the room. "I wonder what the competition will be like this year," she said. "I heard they're being very selective with the scholarships." Marcus laughed confidently. "Competition? I'm not worried about competition. My family has been supporting this academy for 3 generations. My grandfather's name is on one of the practice rooms. He straightened his tie. Besides, I've been preparing for this my whole life. Some people here probably just decided to try music last week. Sarah felt uncomfortable when he said that. She knew he was not talking about her specifically, but his words hurt anyway. She had not just decided to try music last week. She had been playing piano for 7 years, practicing every single day, but she knew what Marcus meant. She was different from everyone else here. Look around, Marcus continued, speaking a little louder now. Half the people here probably learned piano from YouTube videos. They think they can compete with serious musicians who've had proper training. His friends giggled at this comment. Sarah's face felt hot again. She actually had learned some things from YouTube videos. When she could not afford music books, she found free lessons online. When she had questions about technique, she watched professional pianists perform and tried to copy what they did. Marcus was still talking. The scholarship auditions are really just a formality, you know? They like to pretend they're looking for diverse talent, he said, making air quotes with his fingers. But in the end, they choose students who actually belong here, students with proper backgrounds and training. A boy with glasses and a nervous expression approached the group. He was carrying a violin case and looked like he wanted to join the conversation. Excuse me, he said quietly. I'm David. I'm auditioning today too. Marcus looked at David's clothes, which were nice but not expensive. David, welcome. Where did you study? Marcus asked in a friendly tone, but Sarah could hear something else in his voice. I study at the public high school in my town, David answered honestly. My teacher there helped me prepare for this audition. Marcus's smile became less real. Public school? How interesting. And I suppose you've been playing for, what, a couple of years? Actually, I've been playing violin for 8 years, David said, looking proud. I practice 3 hours every day after school. 3 hours? That's cute, said the girl with red hair. Marcus practices 6 hours a day, and that's when he's not busy with performances or master classes. David's face fell a little. Sarah felt sorry for him. She knew exactly how he was feeling right now. Marcus put his hand on David's shoulder, in a way that looked friendly but felt condescending. Don't worry, David. Everyone has to start somewhere. Public school music programs do their best with limited resources. I'm sure your teacher is very dedicated. Sarah watched this interaction and felt angry. Marcus was being mean, but he was doing it in a way that seemed polite. He was making David feel small and unimportant, just like he would probably do to her if they talked. The thing is, Marcus continued, now talking to his original group, but making sure David could hear, musical excellence requires more than just practice. It requires exposure to culture, travel, experiences that broaden your understanding of art. When I played in Vienna, for example, I could feel the history of music in the concert hall. That's something you can't learn from a book. Sarah thought about her own experiences with music. She had never been to Vienna, but she had felt history when she played her grandmother's piano. She had felt the history of her family, of people who worked hard and dreamed of better lives for their children. She had felt the history of songs passed down from mothers to daughters, of music that helped people survive difficult times. But Marcus would probably not think that kind of history was important. He seemed to value only certain types of experiences, the kind that cost a lot of money. A woman in a business suit approached the group. She had a clipboard and looked official. Excuse me, students. I need to give you some information about today's auditions. Everyone became quiet and paid attention. My name is Mrs. Patterson, and I'm the admissions coordinator, the woman said. The auditions will begin in 30 minutes. You'll perform in the main concert hall in front of our faculty panel. Each student will have 15 minutes to perform. They're prepared piece and answer questions. Sarah's stomach felt nervous. 15 minutes to prove she belonged here. 15 minutes to show that her grandmother's lullaby could compete with years of expensive training. Are there any questions? Mrs. Patterson asked. Marcus raised his hand. Will we be performing on the Steinway grand piano? I've prepared my piece specifically for that instrument. Yes, you'll be performing on our concert grand piano, Mrs. Patterson answered. Marcus smiled with satisfaction. Sarah had never played on a grand piano before. She had only seen them in videos and pictures. What if it felt different from Rosa's old upright piano? What if she could not adjust to the sound and touch? Mrs. Patterson continued talking, but Sarah was not listening anymore. She was thinking about the next 30 minutes and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake by coming here. Marcus was still talking quietly to his friends about technical aspects of grand pianos and concert hall acoustics. Sarah realized that while she had been learning to play piano, he had been learning to be a professional musician. There was a difference between loving music and understanding the business of music, but it was too late to leave now. Sarah was here, and she was going to audition. She just hoped that when the time came, her love for music would be enough. After Mrs. Patterson finished talking, the students began discussing their audition pieces with each other. Sarah stayed in her corner chair, hoping no one would notice her, but she could not help listening to their conversations. I'm performing the Chopin Ballade No. 1, announced a girl with perfectly styled blonde hair. My teacher says it's quite advanced for someone my age, but I've been working on it with a master from Juilliard. Impressive choice, said Marcus. I'm playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, third movement. It's technically demanding, but when you've performed it with the Philadelphia Orchestra, playing it solo feels almost simple. Sarah's heart sank. She had heard of these pieces, but they were far more complex than anything she had ever attempted. Her grandmother's lullaby suddenly seemed very small and unimportant compared to these famous classical works. A boy with dark hair mentioned he was playing Bach, and another girl talked about her Liszt piece. Everyone seemed to know exactly which composer and which number their piece was. They used musical terms that Sarah had read about but never heard spoken aloud. Marcus noticed David standing nearby, still holding his violin case. David, what are you playing for us today? Marcus asked loudly, making sure other students could hear. David looked nervous. I'm playing the first movement of Mozart's Violin Concerto No. 3. Mozart, how classic, Marcus said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. A safe choice, very educational? Some of the other students giggled quietly. Sarah felt bad for David again. Marcus had a way of making everything sound like an insult, even when he used polite words. David's face turned red, and he walked away to find a different place to stand. Then Marcus's eyes found Sarah in her corner. And what about you? He called out across the room. You've been very quiet over there. Sarah felt every student in the lobby turn to look at her. Her mouth became dry, and her hands started shaking again. She did not want to talk to Marcus. But now everyone was staring at her and waiting for an answer. She stood up slowly, still holding her old folder. I'm Sarah, she said quietly. Sarah? Marcus repeated, walking closer to her with his group following behind him. What piece have you prepared for your audition? Sarah looked at the folder in her hands. How could she explain her choice? How could she tell these students about her grandmother's lullaby when they were playing concertos and ballades? It's a traditional piece, she said, hoping that would be enough. Marcus raised his eyebrows. Traditional? You mean like folk music? He said the words folk music like they tasted bad in his mouth. Sarah nodded, wishing she could disappear. How interesting, Marcus said, and Sarah could hear the other students starting to whisper. And where did you study this traditional piece? Do you have a private teacher? No, Sarah answered honestly. I taught myself mostly. My grandmother helped me when I was younger. The whispers grew louder. Marcus's smile became bigger and more fake. You taught yourself, and your grandmother was a music teacher? No, she just loved music. She taught me some songs from Mexico, where she grew up. Marcus looked around at his friends with an expression of disbelief. Mexican folk songs? For a scholarship audition at Whitmore Music Academy? He started to laugh, and several other students joined him. Sarah felt her face burning with embarrassment and anger. She wanted to defend her grandmother's music, but she could not find the right words. Everything Marcus said made her feel smaller and more out of place. "Well, this should be quite entertaining," Marcus announced to the whole lobby. "I suppose we'll all get a good laugh before the serious musicians perform." His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. More students gathered around to see what was happening. Sarah heard someone whisper, "Is she really going to play folk music?" Another voice said, "How did she even get an audition?" Marcus was enjoying the attention. "Tell me, Sarah, have you ever performed in public before? In front of an actual audience?" Sarah shook her head. She had only played for her family and Mrs. Johnson at school. "Never?" Marcus looked shocked. "Not even at a school recital or local competition?" "No," Sarah whispered. Marcus turned to his friends. "Can you imagine? She's never performed publicly, she has no formal training, and she's planning to play Mexican folk music. I almost feel bad for the judges who have to sit through this." The girl with red hair giggled. "Maybe they should have separate auditions for different types of music," she said. "Or different types of students," added the blonde girl. Sarah knew they were being cruel, but part of her wondered if they were right. Maybe she did not belong here. Maybe her music was not good enough for a place like Whitmore Music Academy. Marcus was not finished. "Sarah, can you even read music properly, or do you just play by ear like folk musicians do?" "I can read music," Sarah said, but her voice was so quiet that people had to lean in to hear her. "Standard notation? Time signatures? Key signatures?" Marcus asked, using the musical terms like they were a test. Sarah nodded, but she could see that Marcus did not believe her. "What about music theory? Do you understand harmonic progressions? Modulation? Counterpoint?" Each word felt like an attack. Sarah understood some of these concepts from her self-study, but she had never had formal training in music theory. She remained silent, which made Marcus smile even wider. "I see," Marcus said triumphantly. "Well, this is certainly going to be an interesting day for the faculty. I'm sure they've never encountered anything quite like this before." Mrs. Patterson appeared again and announced that the first group of students should prepare to go to the concert hall. Sarah's name was called along with Marcus and several others. As they walked toward the audition room, Marcus spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I hope the judges have a sense of humor today. They're going to need it." His friends laughed, and Sarah heard more whispers behind her. She felt like everyone was looking at her and thinking the same thing Marcus had said out loud. She did not belong here. When they reached the entrance to the concert hall, Sarah stopped walking. Through the glass doors, she could see the most beautiful room she had ever encountered. There were hundreds of red velvet seats arranged in neat rows. The stage was enormous, with a shiny black grand piano sitting in the center under bright lights. "Having second thoughts?" Marcus asked, noticing that Sarah had stopped. "It's not too late to withdraw. Save yourself the embarrassment." Sarah looked at Marcus and his confident friends. They belonged in this beautiful room with their expensive clothes and fancy training. She was just a girl from a poor family who had learned to play on her grandmother's broken piano. But then she thought about Rosa again. She remembered how her grandmother's face would light up when Sarah played her lullaby. She remembered how the simple melody could make Rosa cry with happiness, thinking about her own mother who had sung the same song years ago in Mexico. Marcus might be right about a lot of things. Sarah's training was not formal. Her piece was not complicated. She had never performed in public before. But Marcus was wrong about one thing. Her music mattered. It might not matter to him or his friends, but it mattered to her and to the memory of her grandmother. Sarah took a deep breath and walked through the glass doors into the concert hall. She might not win the scholarship, but she was going to play Rosa's lullaby with all the love in her heart. And if Marcus wanted to laugh at that, let him laugh. At least her music came from a real place, not from trying to impress other people. The concert hall was even more impressive from the inside. Sarah had never seen anything like it. The ceiling was painted with beautiful designs in gold and blue. Crystal lights hung down like frozen waterfalls. The red velvet seats looked soft and expensive. Everything about the room said, "Important music happens here." Sarah and the other students sat in the front row, waiting for their turn to audition. The faculty panel sat at a long table in the center of the hall. There were 5 professors, and they all looked very serious as they reviewed papers and whispered to each other. In the middle of the panel sat a woman with gray hair pulled back in a neat style. She wore a black dress and looked like she had never smiled in her entire life. Sarah heard Marcus whisper to his friend that this was Professor Elizabeth Chun, the head of the piano department. She was famous around the world for training concert pianists. Behind the professors, Sarah could see parents and family members filling the seats. Marcus's parents were easy to spot. His father wore an expensive suit and kept checking his gold watch. His mother had on a dress that probably cost more than Sarah's mother made in a month. They looked comfortable and confident, like they attended events like this all the time. Sarah's mother could not come to the audition because she had to work. She was taking care of an elderly woman who needed help during the day. Before Sarah left home that morning, her mother had hugged her tightly and said, "Play for Grandma Rosa today, Mia. She's watching over you." Mrs. Patterson stood up and explained how the auditions would work. Each student would perform their piece completely, and then the professors might ask questions or request them to play certain sections again. The students would perform in alphabetical order by last name. Sarah realized this meant Marcus would go before her. Since Wellington came before Martinez in the alphabet, she was relieved. She could watch him perform and maybe learn something about how to handle being on stage, but she was also nervous because Marcus was so confident about his abilities. What if he played so beautifully that the professors were not interested in hearing anyone else? The first student was called to perform. It was David, the boy with the violin who Marcus had embarrassed earlier. David walked to the stage slowly, looking terrified. Sarah felt sorry for him and hoped he would do well. David began playing Mozart, and Sarah could tell he was talented. His technique was good, and he played with careful attention to every note, but Sarah could also see that he was nervous. His hands were shaking slightly, and he made a few small mistakes. When he finished, the professors thanked him politely and wrote notes on their papers. 2 more students performed piano pieces. Both were technically skilled, but Sarah noticed that their playing sounded similar to each other. They played the right notes at the right times, but there was something missing. The music was perfect but not exciting. Then Mrs. Patterson called Marcus's name. Marcus stood up with complete confidence. He straightened his tie, smiled at his parents in the audience, and walked to the stage like he owned the place. When he sat at the piano bench, he took a moment to adjust it carefully and test the pedals. Everything he did looked professional and practiced. Professor Chun announced his piece, Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto, No. 2/3 movement. Sarah had heard this piece before in recordings, and she knew it was extremely difficult. The music was fast and required incredible technical skill. Most professional pianists found it challenging. Marcus placed his hands on the keys and began to play. Immediately, Sarah could tell that he was an exceptional pianist. His fingers moved across the keys with perfect accuracy. Every note was clear and precise. The fast passages sounded effortless, like he was not even trying hard. The music filled the huge concert hall with rich, powerful sound. Sarah had to admit that Marcus played beautifully. His years of expensive training showed in every phrase. He understood exactly how to use the grand piano to create the sound he wanted. But as Sarah listened, she noticed something strange. While Marcus's playing was technically perfect, it did not make her feel anything. The music was impressive, but it was cold. It sounded like Marcus was showing off his skills rather than expressing emotions. She looked around the audience and saw that people were nodding with approval. Marcus's parents looked proud but not surprised, as if they expected this level of performance. The professors were writing notes and seemed pleased with what they were hearing. When Marcus finished, the applause was strong and immediate. Professor Chun even smiled slightly, which Sarah had not seen her do for any other student. "Very impressive, Mr. Wellington," Professor Chun said. "Your technical preparation is excellent. Can you tell us what this piece means to you personally?" Marcus stood up from the piano bench and spoke clearly into the microphone. This concerto represents the pinnacle of Romantic piano literature. Rachmaninoff composed it during a period of personal struggle, and it demonstrates the triumph of artistic will over adversity. When I perform it, I try to honor both the composer's original intent and the tradition of great pianists who have interpreted this work before me. Sarah noticed that Marcus's answer sounded like he had memorized it from a textbook. He used the right words, but they did not sound like they came from his heart. Professor Chun nodded. And why did you choose this particular movement for your audition? The third movement showcases the full range of piano technique, Marcus answered smoothly. It requires speed, power, precision, and musical maturity. I felt it would best demonstrate my readiness for advanced study at Whitmore Academy. Again, his answer was perfect but felt rehearsed. Sarah wondered if Marcus had practiced answering these questions just like he had practiced playing the piano. Think. You, Mr. Wellington, Professor Chun said. Please take your seat. Marcus walked back to the front row with a confident smile. His friends whispered congratulations to him, and he accepted their praise like he deserved it, though Sarah felt her stomach drop as she watched Marcus return to his seat. How could she follow a performance like that? Her simple lullaby would sound like child's music compared to Rachmaninoff's concerto. Mrs. Patterson looked at her list and called the next name. It was not Sarah's turn yet, but it would be soon. Only 2 more students before her. Sarah tried to calm herself down by thinking about her grandmother. Rosa had always told her that music was not about impressing people. Music is about sharing your heart, Rosa used to say. If you play with love, people will feel that love. But sitting in this fancy concert hall, watching Marcus receive praise for his perfect performance, Sarah wondered if her grandmother had been wrong. Maybe at places like Whitmore Academy, music was about impressing people. Maybe love and heart were not enough. The next student played a batch piece with technical skill but little emotion, just like the others. Then another student performed. Chopin with the same polished but cold approach. Sarah realized that all these students had been trained to play music the same way. They focused on technical perfection and showing off their skills. None of them seemed to be trying to tell a story or share their feelings through the music. Finally, Mrs. Patterson called Sarah's name. Sarah Martinez. Sarah stood up on shaking legs. Her folder felt heavy in her hands as she walked toward the stage. She could hear whispers behind her, and she knew Marcus and his friends were probably smiling, waiting for her to embarrass herself. When Sarah reached the piano, she looked out at the audience and saw hundreds of faces staring at her. The professors looked curious but skeptical. Marcus's parents looked confused, probably wondering why someone like Sarah was auditioning at their elite academy. Sarah sat at the piano bench and almost gasped. The keys felt different from her grandmother's piano. They were perfectly balanced and responded to the slightest touch. The sound that came from the instrument was rich and powerful, nothing like the thin tone of Rosa's old upright piano. Professor Chun looked at her paper. Miss Martinez, what piece will you be performing today? Sarah spoke into the microphone, and her voice sounded small in the big room. I'll be playing a traditional Mexican lullaby called Dorm Negrito. My grandmother taught it to me. Sarah. Heard Marcus laugh quietly behind her. Someone in the audience whispered, a lullaby? Professor Chun raised her eyebrows but said nothing. She made a note on her paper and nodded for Sarah to begin. Sarah placed her hands on the beautiful keys of the grand piano. Her fingers were shaking and her heart was beating so fast she thought everyone could hear it. She took a deep breath and thought about Rosa's words, play with love, Mia. Then Sarah pressed down on middle C and everything changed. The single note hung in the air like magic. Sarah had only pressed middle C, but somehow that one note contained everything she felt about music, about her grandmother, about love and loss and hope. The sound was pure and clear, ringing through the concert hall with a beauty that made everyone stop breathing. Sarah held the note for a long moment, letting it fill the space around her. She was no longer thinking about Marcus or the professors, or the fancy audience. She was thinking about Rosa, sitting beside her at the old upright piano in their small apartment. Then Sarah began to play. The melody started simply. just like Rosa had taught her years ago. Durm negrito Q tengo Q hey sir, Sarah sang quietly in her mind as her fingers found the familiar notes. Sleep, little one, I have work to do. It was a song that mothers in Mexico had sung to their children for generations, but as Sarah continued playing, something magical happened. The simple lullaby began to grow and change. Sarah added harmonies that she had learned from classical music books. She wove in techniques that she had discovered watching piano videos online. The traditional melody became richer and more complex, but it never lost its heart. Sarah's arrangement told a story. It began with the gentle voice of a mother singing to her child. Then it grew to include the sound of working hands, of long days and difficult nights. There were phrases that spoke of leaving one country and traveling to another, carrying only memories and dreams. The music painted pictures of Rosa as a young woman, coming to America with nothing but hope. It sang of raising children while missing her own mother back in Mexico. It whispered of the sacrifices mothers make so their children can have better lives. As Sarah played, she forgot about her nervousness. Her hands stopped shaking, and her fingers found their way across the keys with confidence she had never felt before. The grand piano responded to her touch like it understood what she was trying to say. Every note came out exactly as she intended, full of emotion and meaning. In the audience, people began to lean forward in their seats. The whispers and rustling sounds stopped completely. Even Marcus, who had been smiling and waiting for Sarah to make mistakes, found himself listening with growing amazement. Sarah's music was nothing like what the other students had played. Where their performances had been cold and perfect, hers was warm and alive. Where they had focused on showing off their technical skills, she was telling a story that touched people's hearts. Professor Chun, who had maintained a stern expression all day, felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She had heard thousands of auditions over the years, and most of them sounded exactly the same. Students played difficult pieces to prove they were talented, but they rarely played music that actually moved her. Sarah's simple lullaby was doing something that Rachmaninoff and Chopin had not done that day. It was making her feel something real. In the middle section of her arrangement, Sarah's music became more intense. The lullaby transformed into something that spoke of struggle and determination. These were the sounds of her mother working 2 jobs, of Sarah herself practicing piano after long days at the coffee shop, of dreams that seemed impossible but refused to die. Sarah's hands moved across the keys with passion and purpose. She was not just playing notes. She was sharing her life, her family's history, her grandmother's love. Every phrase came from her heart, and the audience could feel it. Marcus watched in growing shock. He had expected Sarah to embarrass herself with a clumsy performance of simple folk music. Instead, he was hearing something extraordinary. Sarah's playing was not technically perfect like his had been, but it was something much more important. It was authentic. For the first time in his life, Marcus understood the difference between playing music and making music. He had spent years learning to play the right notes at the right times. He could perform incredibly difficult pieces without making mistakes. But he had never done what Sarah was doing right now. He had never opened his heart and let the music flow out naturally. As Sarah's arrangement continued, she brought the lullaby back to its gentle beginning. But now the simple melody carried all the weight of the story she had told. When Rosa had sung this song to Sarah as a child, it was just a sweet tune to help her fall asleep. Now it was a song about love, sacrifice, hope, and the dreams that parents pass down to their children. Sarah played the final phrase with infinite tenderness. The last notes faded slowly, like a mother's voice getting quieter as her child drifts off to sleep. Then there was complete silence. The silence lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The entire concert hall was frozen in a moment of perfect stillness. Sarah lifted her hands from the keys and looked out at the audience. What she saw surprised her. People were staring at her with expressions of wonder and amazement. Some had tears in their eyes. Even the professors, who had looked bored and skeptical all day, were sitting perfectly still, as if they had just witnessed something miraculous. Marcus felt like someone had hit him in the stomach. All his life he had been told that he was special, that his expensive training made him better than other musicians. He had believed that technical perfection was the most important thing in music. But Sarah had just played a simple folk song and created something more beautiful than anything he had ever heard. In the back of the hall, a woman who worked as a janitor at the academy had stopped cleaning to listen. She was from El Salvador, and Sarah's music had reminded her of songs her own grandmother used to sing. Tears were streaming down her face as she remembered her childhood and the family she had left behind. Professor Chun was struggling to maintain her professional composure. In her 40 years of teaching, she had heard students play the most complex pieces in the piano repertoire. She had trained pianists who went on to perform with major orchestras around the world. But she had rarely heard anything as moving as Sarah's simple arrangement of her grandmother's lullaby. Sarah sat at the piano bench, unsure of what to do next. The silence was so complete that she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Maybe her music was too different, too simple, too emotional for a place like this. Then Professor Chun cleared her throat softly. When she spoke, her voice was gentler than it had been all day. "Miss Martinez," she said, "can you tell us about that piece?" Sarah took a deep breath. Her voice was still shaking, but now it was from emotion rather than fear. "My grandmother Rosa taught me that song when I was little," Sarah said. "She used to sing it to me before bed. When she died 2 years ago, I started playing it on the piano to remember her. I added my own harmonies and arrangements, but the melody is the same one that her grandmother probably sang to her in Mexico." Professor Chun nodded slowly. "And, what does the music mean to you?" Sarah thought for a moment. "It means love. It means the sacrifices that mothers and grandmothers make for their families. It means carrying your history and your culture with you, even when you move to a new place. It means that simple music can be just as beautiful as complicated music if it comes from your heart." The professor made notes on her paper, but her expression had completely changed. She was no longer the stern, intimidating woman who had been judging performances all day. She looked like someone who had just remembered why she became a musician in the first place. "Thank you, Miss Martinez," Professor Chun said softly. "That was quite remarkable." As Sarah walked back to her seat, she could feel everyone's eyes on her. But this time, the attention did not make her uncomfortable. She had played her grandmother's lullaby with all the love in her heart, and people had heard that love. Whatever happened next, she knew she had honored Rosa's memory. Marcus watched Sarah sit down, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly humbled. He had laughed at her simple folk music, but she had just created something that his years of expensive training had never taught him how to do. She had touched people's souls with her music. The concert hall remained unusually quiet as Mrs. Patterson prepared to call the next student. But everyone in the room knew that something special had just happened. Sarah Martinez had played one note and everything had changed. After Sarah returned to her seat, the atmosphere in the concert hall had completely changed. The remaining students performed their pieces, but everyone seemed distracted. Parents whispered quietly to each other. The professors took notes with more thoughtful expressions. Even Marcus sat in unusual silence, staring at the stage where Sarah had just performed. When the last student finished playing, Mrs. Patterson announced that the auditions were complete. The professors would deliberate and contact students within 1 week with their decisions. As people began to leave the hall, Sarah gathered her old folder and started walking toward the exit. "Sarah, wait." She turned around and saw Marcus approaching her. His confident smile was gone, replaced by something Sarah had not seen from him before: uncertainty. "That was ... Marcus paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "Your performance was really something." Sarah was not sure how to respond. After everything Marcus had said about her music being entertainment and her lack of proper training, she had not expected him to speak to her again. "Thank you," she said quietly. Marcus looked around to make sure his friends were not listening, then stepped closer. "Can I ask you something? How did you learn to play like that? I told you earlier. I taught myself mostly, and my grandmother helped me when I was young. No. Marcus struggled again. How did you learn to make music feel like that? When you played, it was like you were telling a story. I could see your grandmother. I could feel the emotions you were describing. How do you do that? Sarah thought about his question. I don't really know. I just play what I feel. When I think about my grandmother, the music comes out differently than when I think about other things. Marcus nodded slowly. I've been playing piano for 15 years. I've had the best teachers money can buy. I can play pieces that most people couldn't even attempt. But when I heard you today, ... double quotes, he trailed off. What? Sarah asked. When I heard you today, I realized that I've never actually made music. I've just been playing notes. Really, really well, but just notes. Sarah did not know what to say to that. She had been so intimidated by Marcus's technical skills and confident attitude. It had never occurred to her that he might feel lacking. In some way, your piece was beautiful too, she offered. The Rachmaninoff was very impressive. Marcus laughed, but it was not a happy sound. Impressive, yes. That's exactly the problem. My music is always impressive, but it's never ... moving. It never makes people cry or think about their grandmothers or remember where they came from. Professor Chun approached them before Sarah could respond. The stern woman from the audition panel now looked much more approachable. Miss Martinez, might I have a word with you? Sarah felt nervous again. Of course. Professor Chun led Sarah to a quiet corner of the lobby while Marcus watched from a distance. I want you to know that in my 40 years of teaching, I have rarely heard anything quite like your performance today, Professor Chun began. Your technical skills need development, certainly. Your formal music theory knowledge requires work. But what you have, that ability to communicate emotion through music that cannot be taught. Sarah felt her heart beating faster. Was this good news or bad news? I've been wondering, Professor Chun continued, whether you would be interested in studying here not just as a student, but as part of a new program I've been developing. What kind of program? We've been discussing the need to expand our curriculum to include more diverse musical traditions and approaches. Your audition today reminded me that classical music shouldn't exist in isolation from other forms of musical expression. I'd like to offer you a full scholarship, and I'd also like you to help us develop courses that blend traditional folk music with classical techniques. Sarah stared at Professor Chun in shock. Not only was she being offered the scholarship she had hoped for, but she was being asked to contribute to the Academy's curriculum. You would be a student, but also a teacher of sorts. You could help other students learn what you demonstrated today, how to connect emotionally with their music. Many of our students are technically excellent but struggle to communicate feeling through their playing. Sarah thought about Marcus and realized that Professor Chun was exactly right. Most of the students she had heard today played beautifully but coldly. Would I still be able to learn classical techniques and music theory? Sarah asked. Absolutely. In fact, I think combining your natural musical instincts with formal training could produce something quite extraordinary. Are you interested? Sarah felt like she was dreaming. A few hours ago, she had been worried about embarrassing herself in front of these sophisticated musicians. Now she was being offered not just admission, but a chance to help teach other students. Yes, she said barely. Able to speak? Yes, I'm very interested. Professor Chun smiled, the first real smile Sarah had seen from her all day. Excellent. We'll arrange for you to begin private lessons with me this fall, along with your regular coursework. I think we're going to do great things together. As Professor Chun walked away, Sarah stood in the lobby trying to process what had just happened. She had gotten the scholarship. She would be studying at Whitmore Music Academy. And she would be helping to teach other students about emotional expression in music. Marcus approached her again. Having watched the conversation from across the room, good news? He asked. I got the scholarship, Sarah said, still not quite believing it. That's wonderful. You deserved it, Marcus paused. Can I ask you another favor? What? Would you be willing to teach me? Not piano technique, I have that covered. But what you do, the way you connect with music emotionally, I want to learn. How to do that? Sarah looked at Marcus with surprise. He was asking her to teach him after spending the entire day making fun of her background and her folk music. I know I was awful to you earlier, Marcus said, reading her expression. I was threatened by something I didn't understand. I thought music was about proving how talented you are, about showing off your technical skills. But you showed me something. Completely different today, Sarah considered his request. Despite how badly Marcus had treated her, she could see that he was genuinely asking for help. And Professor Chun had just told her that part of her role would be helping other students connect emotionally with their music. Okay, she said. But first, you have to promise me something. What? Promise me you'll never make fun of someone's background or their music again. Everyone has something valuable to offer, even if it's different from what you're used to. Marcus nodded seriously. I promise. And Sarah? I'm sorry about how I acted today. You were brave to audition here, and I tried to make you feel small because I was insecure about my own playing. Thank you for apologizing, Sarah said. And yes, I'll help you if I can. As Sarah left the academy that day, she thought about how much had changed in just a few hours. She had arrived that morning feeling like she didn't belong, convinced that her simple folk music could never compete with classical training and expensive education, but she had learned something important. The most sophisticated technical skills in the world mean nothing if they don't come from the heart. Her grandmother's lullaby had moved people in ways that perfect performances of famous classical pieces had not. Sarah realized that Rosa had been right all along. Music wasn't about impressing people or proving how talented you were. Music was about sharing your heart, telling your story, and connecting with other human beings through the universal language of emotion. As she walked to the bus stop, Sarah could almost hear Rosa's voice whispering in the wind. I'm proud of you, Mia. You played with love, and love always wins. Sarah smiled and hummed her grandmother's lullaby as she waited for the bus to take her home. Tomorrow she would call her mother and tell her the incredible news. But tonight she just wanted to sit quietly and remember Rosa, the woman who had taught her that the most beautiful music comes not from perfect technique, but from an open heart. The applause that finally erupted in the concert hall was unlike anything anyone had heard during the auditions that day. It started slowly, with one person clapping, then another, until the entire room was filled with thunderous sound. People were not just clapping politely like they had for the other performances. They were standing up, some wiping tears from their eyes, others shaking their heads in amazement. Sarah sat at the piano bench, overwhelmed by the response. She had never heard applause like this before. At home, when she played for her family, they would smile and tell her it was beautiful. But this was different. This was hundreds of people showing their appreciation for her music in a way that made the whole building seem to shake. Professor Chun was the first to stand up from the faculty panel. Her usual stern expression had been replaced by something Sarah had never seen from her, genuine emotion. The professor's eyes were bright with tears that she was trying to control, but her professional demeanor had completely disappeared. As the applause continued, Sarah looked out at the audience and saw something remarkable happening. In the back section where parents and family members sat, people were talking to each other even while they clapped. Strangers were sharing tissues and nodding to each other as if Sarah's music had created an instant connection between them. Marcus remained in his seat for a long moment, still staring at Sarah with an expression of complete shock. His friends around him were clapping, but they kept looking at Marcus, waiting to see how he would react. Finally, slowly, Marcus began to clap, too, but his applause was different from the others. It was thoughtful, almost reverent, as if he was clapping not just for Sarah's performance, but for something about music that he was understanding for the first time. David, the nervous violin player who had performed earlier, was clapping enthusiastically from the seat in the front row. He had tears in his eyes, and Sarah realized that her performance had probably meant something special to him. Like her, he came from a modest background and had felt out of place among all the wealthy confident students. The janitor, who had stopped her work to listen, was still standing in the back of the hall, clapping with rough hands that spoke of years of hard work. She was crying openly now, not caring who saw her. Sarah's music had reminded her of her own grandmother, her own journey from one country to another, her own struggles to build a better life for her children. Even Marcus's parents, who had looked confused and slightly annoyed when Sarah first announced her simple lullaby, were now clapping with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. His mother had a puzzled expression on her face, as if she could not understand how such a simple piece of music had affected her so deeply. Professor Chun finally raised her hand to quiet the applause, but it took several attempts before the crowd settled down. When the hall became quiet again, the silence was different from before. It was not the polite, expectant silence of an audience waiting for the next performance. It was the profound silence that follows something truly meaningful. "Miss Martinez," Professor Chun said, and her voice was softer than anyone had heard it all day. "That was extraordinary." More whispers rippled through the audience. People were still processing what they had just experienced. Sarah's performance had lasted only about 5 minutes, but it felt like she had taken them on a journey that lasted much longer. In the faculty section, the other professors were exchanging glances and whispering among themselves. Professor Williams, who taught music theory, was shaking his head with a smile of amazement. Professor Rodriguez, the head of performance studies, was writing rapidly on his notepad. Professor Jackson, who specialized in music history, looked like she was rethinking everything she thought she knew about the relationship between traditional and classical music. "I have been teaching and performing for 4 decades, Professor Chun continued, looking directly at Sarah. "I have heard students play the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. I have witnessed performances by some of the world's finest pianists, but what you just did, what you just shared with us, that was music in its purest form." The hall remained completely silent as Professor Chun spoke. Even the professors seemed surprised by her emotional response. "You took a simple melody, a lullaby that a grandmother sang to her granddaughter, and you transformed it into something that spoke to every person in this room. You reminded us why we fell in love with music in the first place." Sarah felt overwhelmed by Professor Chun's words. She had come to the audition hoping simply to not embarrass herself. She had never imagined that her grandmother's lullaby could have such a powerful effect on so many people. Marcus was still staring at Sarah, but his expression had changed completely. The arrogant confidence he had displayed all day was gone. In its place was something like wonder mixed with what might have been regret. He appeared to be thinking deeply about something, as if Sarah's performance had forced him to reconsider everything he believed about music and about himself. In the audience, conversations were starting quietly as people tried to process what they had just heard. A woman near the back was telling her husband about her own grandmother's songs. A teenage girl was explaining to her parents how Sarah's music had made her think about her own cultural heritage. An elderly man was simply sitting with his eyes closed, as if he was still listening to the echoes of Sarah's lullaby. Professor Chun looked around the hall, taking in the faces of the audience, the expressions of her fellow faculty members, and the obvious impact that Sarah's performance had made on everyone present. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the entire hall, "I think we have just witnessed something very special. Miss Martinez has reminded us that technical perfection, while important, is not the ultimate goal of musical education. The ultimate goal is to touch human hearts, to communicate emotions and experiences that connect us all." More applause began, but Professor Chun raised her hand again. "Furthermore," she continued, "I believe Miss Martinez has demonstrated something that we as educators need to learn from. She has shown us that musical traditions from all cultures have something valuable to offer our understanding of what music can be and do." Sarah felt like she was in a dream. Not only had her performance been well received, but Professor Chun was talking about it as if it had taught the faculty something important about music education. Marcus finally stood up from his seat. He walked slowly toward the stage, and for A moment Sarah thought he might be coming to confront her or to say something cruel. But when he reached the area near the piano, he simply looked at her with an expression she had never seen from him before. "Sarah," he said, and his voice carried clearly through the quiet hall, "I owe you an apology. A big one." The audience watched with interest as Marcus struggled to find the right words. "I spent all day making fun of your background and your music. I thought that because I had expensive training and you didn't, that meant my music was automatically better than yours. I was wrong. Completely wrong." Marcus looked out at the audience, then back at Sarah. "What you just did up there? That's what music is supposed to be. I've been playing piano for 15 years, and I just realized that I've never actually made music the way you did today. I've just been playing notes, even if I played them really well." The hall remained silent as Marcus continued. "I want to learn how to do what you do. Not the technical stuff, I can handle that. But the other thing, the way you made everyone in this room feel something real. Will you teach me?" Sarah looked at Marcus, seeing him clearly for the first time. Under all his arrogance and expensive clothes, he was just another young person who loved music and wanted to be good at it. His question was sincere, and she could see that her performance had genuinely changed something in his understanding of what music could be. "Yes," Sarah said simply. "I'll help you if I can." The applause that followed was different from before. It was not just appreciation for a beautiful performance. It was applause for a moment of human connection, for the breaking down of barriers, for the recognition that music really could bring people together across all the differences that usually kept them apart. As the sound filled the concert hall one more time, Sarah realized that her grandmother's lullaby had done something even more important than winning her a scholarship. It had reminded everyone in that room why they loved music in the first place. 6 months had passed since that life-changing audition day at Whitmore Music Academy. The grand concert hall that had once intimidated Sarah now felt like a second home. She walked across the familiar marble floors of the lobby, no longer the nervous girl clutching an old folder, but a confident young woman carrying herself with quiet grace. Sarah's transformation had been remarkable, but not in the way anyone might have expected. She had not changed to fit into the Academy's elite culture. Instead, the Academy had begun to change around her. Professor Chun had kept her promise about the new program. Sarah was not just a scholarship student anymore. She had become a bridge between two musical worlds. 3 days a week, she took advanced piano lessons and music theory classes. The other 2 days, she taught workshops called Music from the Heart, where she helped classical students connect emotionally with their performances. Her first class had been small, just 5 students who were curious about this different approach to music. David, the nervous violin player from her audition day, had been one of the first to sign up. "I want to learn how to make people feel something when I play," he had told her. By the end of the first month, Sarah's workshops had a waiting list. Students who had spent years perfecting their technique were discovering that they had been missing something essential in their musical education. Sarah taught them to think about the stories behind their pieces, to connect their own experiences with the emotions the composers had tried to express. Marcus had been her most dedicated student. The arrogant young man who had mocked her background had become one of her closest friends and most eager learners. Every week he came to Sarah's workshop with the same question: how do I make my music mean something? It had taken months of patient work, but Marcus was finally beginning to understand. His playing was still technically perfect, but now it had warmth and genuine emotion. Just last week, he had performed the same Rachmaninoff concerto from his audition, but this time the audience had been moved to tears. The notes were the same, but Marcus had learned to play them with his heart instead of just his hands. "I never realized how empty my music was before," Marcus had told Sarah after that performance. "I thought being good at piano meant playing fast and not making mistakes. I didn't know it was supposed to make people feel things." Sarah's influence had spread beyond her workshops. Professor Chun had restructured the entire curriculum to include more emphasis on emotional expression and cultural diversity in music. Students now learned about musical traditions from around the world, not just European classical music. They studied how different cultures use music to tell stories, express emotions, and bring communities together. The Academy had also started a scholarship program specifically for students from underrepresented backgrounds. They called it the Rosa Martinez Memorial Scholarship, named after Sarah's grandmother. Every year, the Academy would provide full scholarships to 5 students who showed musical talent, but lacked the financial resources for formal training. Sarah had suggested the name for the scholarship program during a meeting with the faculty. "My grandmother never had the chance to study music formally," she had explained. "But she understood something about music that took me years to learn, that it's not about showing off or impressing people. It's about sharing love." The first recipients of the Rosa Martinez scholarships had arrived at the Academy just 2 months ago. There was Maria, a girl from Texas who played guitar and sang traditional folk songs. There was James, a boy from Detroit who had taught himself piano by listening to jazz records in his grandfather's barbershop. There was Amara, whose family had immigrated from Somalia and who could make the violin sound like it was singing in her native language. These new students brought their own musical traditions and perspectives to the Academy. Instead of being pressured to abandon their backgrounds, they were encouraged to blend their cultural music with classical techniques. The Academy was becoming a place where different musical traditions met and learned from each other. Sarah often thought about how much had changed since that terrifying audition day. She remembered sitting in the corner of the lobby, feeling like she didn't belong, wondering if her simple folk music could ever compete with classical training and expensive education. Now, she understood that the question had been wrong from the beginning. Music was not supposed to be a competition. Different types of music were not supposed to compete with each other. They were supposed to complement each other, learn from each other, and create something beautiful together. Professor June had become not just Sarah's teacher, but her mentor and friend. The stern woman who had intimidated Sarah so much during the audition had revealed herself to be passionate about music, education, and eager to learn new approaches to teaching. "You have taught me as much as I have taught you," Professor Chun had told Sarah just last week. "I had forgotten that the purpose of music education is not to create perfect performers. It is to help students discover their own musical voices and learn to share them with the world." The Academy's spring concert was scheduled for next week, and Sarah had been chosen to perform the closing piece. She had decided to play an arrangement that combined her grandmother's lullaby with classical elements she had learned during her months of study. The piece had evolved from the simple version she had played at her audition into something more complex but equally heartfelt. Marcus would be performing too, playing a piece he had composed himself that blended his classical training with melodies inspired by Sarah's workshops. David had written a violin concerto that incorporated folk songs from his Irish heritage. Maria would be singing, and James would be playing jazz-influenced classical pieces. As Sarah walked through the Academy halls, she passed the practice rooms where students were preparing for the concert. Through the doors, she could hear the sounds of students working not just on technical perfection, but on emotional expression. She heard a girl playing Chopin with genuine feeling, a boy practicing Bach while thinking about the stories he wanted to tell, another student working on a piece that combined classical piano with traditional Korean melodies. In one practice room, Sarah saw Marcus working with one of the new scholarship students, helping him understand how to connect emotionally with his music. Marcus had become as passionate about teaching emotional expression as Sarah was. "Remember," she heard Marcus saying, "the notes are just the beginning. The real music happens when you add your heart to them." Sarah smiled as she continued down the hall. 6 months ago, Marcus had been cruel to students like this boy, making fun of their backgrounds and their non-traditional musical training. Now he was one of their most supportive teachers and advocates. Sarah reached her own practice room and sat down at the piano. In a few days, she would perform in front of a large audience that would include her mother, Mrs. Johnson from her high school, and many of the Academy's wealthy donors and trustees. But she was not nervous this time. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play her grandmother's lullaby. As the familiar melody filled the small room, Sarah could almost hear Rosa's voice humming along. The song that had started as a simple lullaby sung by a Mexican grandmother to her granddaughter had become something that connected people across cultures, backgrounds, and musical traditions. Sarah's music had taught the Academy an important lesson: that the most beautiful and meaningful music comes not from technical perfection alone, but from the courage to share your authentic self with the world. Her grandmother's lullaby had done more than win Sarah a scholarship. It had reminded an entire institution what music was really supposed to be about. As Sarah continued playing, she thought about all the students who would come to the Academy. In future years, students like Maria and James and Amara, students who might feel out of place at first, but who would discover that their unique musical voices were exactly what the world needed to hear. Rosa's lullaby had become a song about transformation, not just Sarah's transformation from a nervous auditioner to a confident student and teacher, but the transformation of an entire musical community that had learned to value heart as much as technique, authenticity as much as perfection, and love as much as skill. Sarah finished playing and sat quietly in the practice room, feeling grateful for everything that had led her to this moment. Her grandmother had been right all along. When you play with love, people feel that love. And when people feel that love, it changes them in ways that perfect technique never could. The girl who had once been afraid to share her simple folk music with sophisticated classical musicians had become a teacher who helped others discover the courage to share their own authentic musical voices. Sarah's story had become proof that sometimes the most unexpected voices have the most important things to say, and that the most beautiful music comes from the places where different worlds meet and learn to sing together.